Good afternoon, students of British and American culture. We're really moving along here. We're on week 9 here. This is part 3 of the Tale of Two Empires, although this mostly involves one empire, which is the American one, which they don't like to call an empire, but we will, for the sake of argument, call it that. I actually originally came up with the title because, there's Charles Dickens writes this awesome book. You may not think it's awesome because it's really long, but if you manage to get through it, it's a fantastic perspective on the French Revolution, and I highly recommend it. So that's why it's called A Tale of Two Empires, because I was just doing a spin on his famous novel, A Tale of Two Cities. First thing to announce, before we talk about the stuff at the end of the 19th century in America, I would like you to do another assignment, and I did have, I think, only a couple students say, "Oh, I didn't know that there was an assignment." Well, you have to listen to the lecture if you want to know the instructions. So here it is, right at the beginning. I expect you to listen to this whole lecture, but especially take note of this. In 2 weeks, today is March 2nd, so March 16th. No, sorry, that's not going to be right. Today is March 2nd. But this is the end of the week. So I'm going to ask you to have this done on Thursday, which is going to be the 14th. This is due May 14th. I think I just said March. Everything's confusing. I don't know what month it is or what day it is. But it is May. So this is due May 14th. And I will put, this time, I will put an assignment due date just to give you an extra warning on the website. So this is week 9, so it'll be due week 11. This is what I want you to do. I want you to choose one of the 5 basic ideas, principles, or purposes, or concepts that I introduced to you on the first lecture. The 5 of them were freedom, opportunity, manifest destiny, beliefs, and contradiction. And if you go back to that lecture and you watch it again, you will see on my board I have them written down. So you can watch the lecture again if you want, where I explain them all. But basically what I want you to do is just take one of them, take one of these 5, and then talk about how a certain part of America is an example. So, and I want you to make use of some of the other ideas that I introduced to you, like dominant culture, counterculture, subculture, or revolution and evolution, or historical context, or social context, or cultural context. All of these things are in the textbook for you to read and go over. This assignment I'm giving you 2 weeks for because I'm going to grade it. The reason that I'm doing this is because every semester I have a graded assignment, but this one in particular is going to be more valuable than usual because the grading policy has been relaxed. I'm allowed to give 50% of you A's, but it's still going to be hard to distinguish between A's and B's. The exam will be one of the primary means for me to evaluate you, but I don't want to have everything riding on the exam, because that's just, I know Koreans actually do this. A lot of you are Korean, but some of you are not. But the sunung is an experience which is very traumatic, because 100% of your opportunity, or the value of the test of the checking of your ability is related to your score on the sunung. So it's like, if you pass the sunung, you're good, and if you fail, you're done. And I don't want it to be like that. We have various other things, like the assignment homework you've done so far, which counts, and the attendance on the cyber lecture, which counts as well. And then we'll have this graded assignment, which will take me a while to get through 64 of them. But part of the reason I want you to just look at these 5 things and choose something that you feel is an example of one of these 5 concepts is because it's not going to be easy to plagiarize. And it's always tempting just to copy something from Wikipedia or from a Naver or something. You can't do that. What you have to do is you have to find your own idea, and you have to apply the concepts of our course to it. You're not going to find anything on the internet that gives you exactly what you need to do. So you have to take the concept and you have to find an example of it, and you have to show me how it's a good example yourself. I would like you to give me at least one source, one reference in English, so I can see where you got your information from. Okay? So I would like you to write one page. It should be 12-point font. It should be double spaced. And I want you to choose some sort of event, person, or anything in American culture that you feel is representative of one of these 5 things. It can be anything from right back to, we'll say the beginning of the 17th century, right when King James and Jamestown started from 1607 or really got going in 1620, right from the beginning of colonial America, right up to today. You can choose whatever you want, but you need to explain how this situation, this person embodies that thing, how they're symbolic of this idea of freedom, opportunity, manifest destiny, belief systems, or contradiction. Okay? And I will write up a short little description in a PDF file so you can open it up and get the instructions again. But that's basically what I'm asking you to do. And that will be due in 2 weeks, and I will look them over in detail, and I will give you a grade. Remember, this is not a summary. You need to take the event, and then you need to use your own perspective, and you need to explain it yourself. That's key. If you want to get an A, that's what you have to do. Don't steal, don't copy, just gather information and then process the information, synthesize the information, analyze it, and then give it to me. I want to know what you think, not what the internet thinks. And that's the assignment. That's due in 2 weeks. Now, today, we're doing part 3 to finish up this week, the Tale of Two Empires, but we are talking about one of the empires today. It's just because the textbook does talk about other things, but that's going to carry over into another lecture, so I'm not going to talk about Canada right now, although I will. So, first of all, just to connect what we did in the second lecture, mostly about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant and the abolishment of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, all that stuff happened. Abraham Lincoln, unfortunately, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and I won't get into the details of that, but he suddenly disappeared, and then there was a series of presidents afterwards that had to handle how to fix the divide, how to heal a separated country, and it was not an easy thing. To what extent should they have forgiven, the people who participated and rebelled and insisted on slavery? I think in general they were pretty lenient, but they also destroyed a lot of the infrastructure in the South. So the North occupied the South as if it was a different country, and there were soldiers down there, but at the same time they did allow a lot of rehabilitation of politicians and even soldiers and military personnel. They restored property, but really what they should have done, in retrospect, is that they should have pushed the concept of equality further and insisted that the people in the South were responsible for what happened, and that the punishment should have been carried out permanently. And I mean, everybody's going to have another opinion. That's pretty much a strong in our day and age. What we think is racist and what we think is appropriate behavior, if you took most Americans or Canadians or Koreans back in time to 1865 when the war was over, they would have said, okay, these people are bad people and they need to be punished. We don't need to let them just go back to normal or almost normal. We need to fix it. But they didn't really fix it. So this whole Reconstruction period, it didn't get reconstructed very well. The South still was, the economy was broken. It took a long time for them to recover. There was tons of racist behavior and discrimination that continued, and that's why in the 1960s you have the Civil Rights Movement, because it never got fixed. In some cases it got worse in the South because, they freed all the black people, but what were they supposed to do? I mean, when they were slaves, they had houses and buildings, and there were mostly cruel masters, but there were some masters that gave them shoes and clothes and everything. They weren't all horrible people. Most of them were pretty horrible and racist, and even the ones that were nice were pretty racist. But when you throw somebody out on the street and just say, okay, you're free now, what are they supposed to do? None of those white people were going to hire them because they didn't think of black people as being valuable as human beings or as labor or anything else. They thought they belonged in the fields. So it wasn't like that. I mean, it's a great idea, and it was a great moment in American history that Abraham Lincoln made the Emancipation Proclamation, but that was really politically motivated. That allowed black people to revolt and disrupt the military effort of the South. That was one of the main things that it was about. It wasn't really about we should treat them better. I mean, that was a nice, benefit, hopefully, and it did happen very slowly that black people did eventually get the voting franchise and get better jobs, but it was really not as good as you think. People tend to have these ideas where they conceptualize, okay, there was slavery, and then Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and then everybody was free. No, they were free to be poor and to be discriminated against and to have their own school system and to, go into places separately and be treated as second-class citizens for 100 years more. And then there is still, discrimination built into the system that they have to deal with today. So it's an evolution. I mean, it's not really a revolutionary moment at all. I think that the Emancipation Proclamation sounded like it would be revolutionary, but it was not. Because Reconstruction failed to implement the high-minded ideals of that statement, which maybe Abraham Lincoln wanted to follow through on, but he never had a chance because he was assassinated. Okay, so that's how Reconstruction looks. And the South is very bitter. They have this myth they came up with. Let's talk about myths for a second. Retroactively, they tried to say that there was something called the lost cause. Like it's almost like the same kind of concept that the Germans came up with after they lost World War I, that there was a chance and that everything had nobility to it, and that the South had tried to fight for the rights of the states, and that they could have respect for their heroes and their ancestors and the effort to be independent, and that there was moments in the war where it was just due to the lack of conviction and commitment by the Confederates that they ended up losing. So they come up with this whole romanticized idea of what the South was really trying to accomplish. But again, it's really about trying to keep a racist slave system in place so that the economy can continue to function and that it didn't disrupt their society or their culture. So that is a myth, the myth of the lost cause. That won't be on the test, but it's a good thing to know. We did talk about Paul Bunyan a little bit already in another class, but Paul Bunyan is a fantastic character because he represents the values that Americans had in the early pioneer period, where he was supposedly born in a harbor city in the Northeast, and he was just turned out to be an extremely exaggerated individual who had this incredible strength and stamina and size and power and innocence, and he couldn't survive in his town because he outgrew everyone. He's got mythical proportions. So he's sometimes he's 10 feet tall, sometimes he's 50 feet tall, and he just stomps around everywhere, crushing everything by accident. So he ends up being a lumberjack, and he goes across the entire American continent, just changing the landscape with his behavior. That's on the website. And another individual, Davy Crockett, is on the website. Both of them appear in the textbook too. So I'm not going to explain their stories because that's something that you need to read. So sometimes in the video lecture I explain things in detail, but in order to make this lecture manageable, you need to do a little bit of reading. There's links on the website to the full story, but you need to know the basic ideas. Try to summarize and just make a couple notes about what Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett is a real person. Paul Bunyan is a myth. It's a tall tale. It's an exaggerated story about an imaginary American person, but who represented things, ideals that Americans thought were valuable. Johnny Appleseed is another one of these people, goes across America planting apple trees everywhere. Rick Van Winkle is a guy who goes bowling in the mountains with some weird spirits and gets drunk and then falls asleep for 50 years and everything's turned upside down when he wakes up. These are myths, just like King Arthur and Robin Hood, when we talked about that stuff in British literature, British culture, rather, a couple months ago almost. And they have the same effect, the unifying effect, the teaching morals and lessons and trying to get patriotism and national interest and unifying stories and common education and all those benefits that myths have, whether they're accurate or not, or scientific, doesn't matter. It's just stories that are interesting. It's entertainment that all the citizens grow up paying attention to, and that brings them all together. If you're an immigrant to America and you have your own stories from your own country, and then you learn these stories from the culture around you, then you usually, hopefully, you keep your stories from Italy or France or Ireland or China or Korea or wherever, and then you just add the American stories to it, and you start to feel like inclusive when you know all those stories, and you're, in subsequent generations, you become more American. It's really that's one of the main objects of a mythology, is to incorporate different ethnicities and cultures into it. That's really, King Arthur is a great example of that, but it doesn't really say if Paul Bunyan was Anglo-Saxon or Swedish or German or French or potentially even Spanish or Irish. He's just a big, hairy white dude. And there's no ethnically Asian people like that. But as soon as you start building projects and building America, whether you're African or Asian or anything else, that's what the spirit of the myth is. The tall tale is that he played a gigantic role in the exploration and construction and development of the American wilderness, and certainly all kinds of people from all over the world did that too. Whether or not you look similar to them in terms of your appearance doesn't matter if you just incorporate the spirit of the story. It could be an Asian American who was a gigantic person, building things and knocking down trees and carving animals out of mountains too, and that would be just as valid if that's the way the story was told. That's why sometimes in America you get nowadays you get people playing those roles that look different and they're from different ethnicities, because it shouldn't matter what you look like. Paul Bunyan could be played by anybody. That's my personal opinion, but I am teaching liberal arts here, so keep that in mind. The Gilded Age. I mentioned this in the previous lecture, just on the board, that I was going to talk about this. Gilded means covered in gold, but I think this is one of my favorite expressions to describe any historical period, because the great thing about calling the late 19th century, which is 1870 about, from the Reconstruction era to the turn of the century, about 30 years, is that the Civil War is over, and there was a development, and there was just this, there's something called the entrepreneurial spirit in America, and Koreans, I've heard many Koreans say, like, well, it's just not the same here. In China, it seems to be more similar, but it's not the same in Canada either. It's just this cultural thing that Americans have, and other countries have it too. I think China's a good example, but Americans in particular are just, it's almost like an adventure. Instead of calling it risk, when you start a company and you try a new technology and you make a new product, it's not risk. You might not lose, you might lose everything, but that's not the point. What you're doing is exploring, you're inventing, and the risk is not important. It's an adventure, right? And it's a venture company, venture capital is the investment of money into something, and tons of these companies collapse and fail, and lots of people go bankrupt, but that sparkle in the eye of looking for that success, that possibility of becoming John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie or a Vanderbilt. All these people are legendary because they built their own companies and their families built them up, and they expanded and they innovated, and they built up these massive corporations that it's astronomical the amount of money they had. Everybody talks about Jeff Bezos right now and Amazon and how much money he has, but if you look at what John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in American history, if you look at how much money he had, adjusted for inflation, he had 3 times more money than Bezos. So if Bezos gets up to $400 billion in his personal fortune, he will eclipse John D. Rockefeller. But as of today, as far as I know, and Amazon's making lots of money because everybody's ordering stuff online right now, but just for comparison, John D. Rockefeller would be 3 Jeff Bezos. That's how much money the guy had. So that's real gold. That's not covered in gold, but the concept of gilded means it's gilded on the surface, so it looks like the economy is booming and everybody's doing great, but there's a massive amount of suffering and poor and tension and social problems, and the South is destroyed still. While the North industrializes and Carnegie gets the steel companies going, and he's making huge amounts of, he's constantly improving the steel production and making massive amounts of money, and his workers are being paid more, and everybody's getting jobs, and Rockefeller's got this oil fortune, and he's investing in railroads, and they're just taking over, the businesses are exploding. At the same time, there's a whole bunch of people suffering, and that it's all superficial. It's not like the culture is improving, or the society's improving. There's racism, and people are getting threatened, and there's violence. So it's just like there's this gold covering on it. But if you just remove the gold, it's garbage underneath. That's not necessarily garbage, but it's cheap. On the surface, it looks fantastic and amazing. It's beautiful and expensive, but underneath, it's not necessarily garbage. I'm overstating that. It's basically just it's not as good as it looks. It's just plain. The gold is covering a regular metal, like lead or something, a cheaper metal, and only on the surface does it look shiny and new and expensive. So that's what the Gilded Age means. All these things are going well, but fundamentally, people feel like it's not a deep evolution. It's just a superficial evolution. So part of this is the fact that the Wild West goes on, and the Wild West is basically all these territories opening up, all these people trying to move west. They come into contact with the natives, and they fight them, they displace them, the natives fight back. A lot of these native tribes are kind of warriors by nature. You know, the famous ones that they encounter, the Cherokee, the Sioux, the Apache. These tribes are, they raid. That's part of their culture. They're aggressive, and they raid, and they need a lot of space. And when all these settlers come in there and start building permanent houses all over the place, it's what they would do is steal their stuff. And if you were next to another tribe, your tribe would steal the other tribe's stuff, and the other tribe would steal your stuff. It would be sort of a give and take thing. But the settlers don't look at it like this. This is not American culture. It's like, this stuff is mine. This is my land, and stay off my land or I'll shoot you with my gun. So they constantly, they can't really exist side by side. They're naturally going to fight each other, and there's going to be friction no matter what way you look at it. You can't have nomadic warriors who are raiders beside an organized, settled, lawful community, because it's just not going to work. You're going to have to change the Apaches' culture. You're going to have to force them to change their ways. They can't be horse raiders. They can't be kidnappers and hunters in the old sense if they're going to live next to a civilization like the Americans. So this is just not going to work. So they do their normal behavior. The settlers fight back, and then eventually it gets, it sort of gets worse and worse in a vicious cycle of them attacking each other. And then the American military comes in, and they have more equipment, more people, more weapons, and they force the native people to stay in reservations. They give them large amounts of territory, but they basically ruin their culture because they can't live the way that they've been living. Now, the introduction of horses and guns to the natives really made all this situation even more complicated, because the native cultures adapted to having horses and guns, so they wanted to trade for guns and horses all the time. They got their own guns, but they couldn't really make the guns, and they couldn't really make ammunition because they didn't have any factories or supplies. So once the natives started adapting, the Cherokee, the Sioux, the Apache, once they started using the superior weapons of the Americans, they actually had no choice but to try and trade for more bullets or guns or horses or whatever, or saddle straps or metal, equipment, buckles and everything. All that stuff gave you an advantage, and they knew that, and their culture started to hunt buffalo on horseback, which is not what they did before because there was no horses. The Spanish brought horses to America. Before they did that, horses had gone extinct. So I know everybody has this idea in their head of a native person with a gun or a bow sitting on a horse with a headdress. But that wasn't what they looked like 200 years before. When Columbus and all the rest of the conquistadors and Spanish settlers and missionaries came, they brought the horses with them, and they bred the horses, and the native people adapted and became superior horsemen. They became almost, I would say, actually not almost, they were better at riding and shooting than the Europeans, but they didn't have the industry to equip themselves to fight, and they didn't have the numbers. There was all sort of disadvantages, and so they became dependent on the Americans, and the Americans used this to their advantage. Let's have a war. We're not going to give you any bullets, so let's see how that goes. It didn't go well. You have less people, you have less warriors, you don't have established settlements. We'll attack you in the winter when we have our clothing and all our equipment and food, and you're vulnerable. They took advantage of everything, and this is the tragedy of the whole situation, that there were politicians that tried, British and American politicians both, and Canadian, that tried to give them a fair, deal, but in general, the Europeans were, as human nature is, they were greedy, and they took advantage of the situation to the point where they were basically wiping out groups of people. There's a strong argument to be made that it involves genocide. Entire populations of people, whether intentionally or not, but in many cases intentionally, were wiped off of the face of the earth, and their population never recovered. So this is the reason why Columbus Day is not celebrated by Native people, because that represents the beginning of a long process of decline for the Native people, which is along with the slave trade and the slave triangle, and the forcible importation of African slaves to America. are the two main, I think, crimes of North Americans, that the Europeans were guilty of this criminal behavior, what we would consider a war crime today. Or, sorry, I keep saying war crime, but I mean a crime against humanity to actually destroy people's cultures completely by their selfish behavior. So that is where we're at the end of the 19th century. Now, I didn't write this on the board, but I would like to add this because I didn't want to get too much stuff in the background. But there is a critical thing that's going to happen that I need to mention before we go forward to next week, and that is there is a fundamental difference in the political and cultural attitude of Americans from everything we've talked so far to the turn of the century and the beginning of... It still continues, it still persists until World War II, but I would say at the end of the Gilded Age, when we get to 1900, America has a war with Spain called the Spanish-American War, and this marks the beginning of a turning point in American attitude. From George Washington up until the 1890s, there was something called the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically, but it's George Washington's concept, which he watched. George Washington was British, and he became American through his own choice and his generalship, and became the first president of the United States. But he was a British trained soldier, and he was very aware of the environment in Europe and how European states were constantly at war. And he thought that war was necessary, but that if America got involved in European conflicts, they would have to choose sides, and that it would be destructive for America in the same way the European war was destructive for so many countries. If you look at the history of France and United Kingdom and Belgium and like a lot of these states, Switzerland, Italy, all of these states, I mean, there's Asian wars too, but I think Europe is the worst. In general, Europe, if you look at it, about changing borders and constantly developing weapons, like that's, who knows why Europeans ended up, who knows why all the imperialism, that global imperialism and the spread of European culture had, nobody can say exactly why, but one of the things was that the European states were constantly fighting each other and constantly trying to get an advantage over each other. There was lots of civil wars in China, but China's basically the same size of Europe, but it's one state. But in Europe, you got like 40 states. Why do you have 40 states? Because they're constantly trying to figure out a better way to kill each other. I mean, you had the Roman Empire, and you had the French Empire, and Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, but nobody could hold on to Europe and keep it together. We have the European Union now, but it's more of a negotiated system. It's not one culture dominating the entire area the way China does, or India, or I mean even the United States to a certain extent. So what George Washington wanted to do is just be neutral. Don't take sides. You can help people, or you can supply weapons and supplies and food and equipment to whoever you want, but just don't say, if United Kingdom goes to war against France, then we're at war too. They don't want any of that. So this idea comes from George Washington, and it persists the whole century. And but it starts to change in 1890s, and there's a revolution going on in Cuba, and the Cubans are trying to overthrow Spain because Spain still possesses Cuba and still uses it as a colony essentially. So the Americans decide that they're going to jump in. Because of various incidents, they sort of make some excuses and push public opinion towards being aggressive, and then they fight the Spanish in Cuba, and Theodore Roosevelt actually goes down there with the Rough Riders and fights personally. It's one of his claims to fame. He has many, but that's one of them. and then they end up actually they end up taking the Philippines from the Spanish too, because they continue the war across the entire Pacific, from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, and they just take the colonies away from Spain. And the justification basically is that they need, bases for their steamships and their their ships, their warships. They need Philippines is perfect because they can go across to Hawaii, and then they can jump islands across the Pacific, and they can extend their reach for transportation, for projecting military power, and for trade, and for communication. And so they want to build this network because that's what all the other powerful countries have. Germany and Belgium, even Belgium, which is a very small country relative to the United States in population and size and influence, they had colonies in Africa, and the Dutch, they had colonies in Asia and Southeast Asia, and America didn't. So it was in a way it was an attempt to become a global power, just like all the other states, which the Americans felt that they deserved, because they were becoming a larger and larger state. And there was this kind of fear about America. Everybody knew America was getting bigger and bigger and stronger, and there was a lot of anxiety about what they were going to do with that power. And you can see the same sort of phenomenon happening with China now. Everybody knows China has the biggest population. Everybody knows they have a gigantic economy, and they're getting stronger and stronger. And what are they going to do with it? How are they going to behave when they're competing for the most powerful nation in the world? They're already doing it. So far, so good. I mean, in terms of what I see internationally, it's not any better or worse than any other country, but there is, I think, a natural reaction, a fearful reaction to that kind of behavior. When the Spanish started taking over the world, everybody was afraid of Spain. When Louis XIV was taking over the world, taking all over Europe, and Napoleon, everybody's terrified of what the French would do to you. So that's just a knee-jerk reaction. And that's the point where we're at. Next lecture, when we talk about the 20th century, it's going to be this big. It's going to be a revolutionary moment. It's going to be a turning point in American history when the United States decides to take a global role and take responsibility, the way sort of the British have already done. That they're going to be involved in these external conflicts that have nothing to do with them necessarily, but they're going to be involved in global politics in a way that an isolationist country would not do. So they're going to take sides, and they're going to make decisions, and they're going to participate in things overseas in a way that they've never done before. And that will be the subject of the first lecture next week. So that is the end of week number 9, Tale of Two Empires, part 3.